Well, councillors and executive team, welcome to the chambers for the Gunnedah Shire Council. I'll officially open our ordinary meeting for the month of June right now at 4:30, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kamilaroi people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, and pay my respects to elders both past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal community members who might be with us today or listening in virtually to our YouTube live stream. I'd now like to please ask everybody to be upstanding for prayer. Eternal God, our loving Father, we come to Thee this day in the name of Jesus Christ, who is the lover of our souls and the Saviour of all mankind. May we feel His love and respond to it. May His Spirit shine in lives that are darkened by worry, doubt or fear. Strengthen and guide those who are trying to do what is right. Make it plain to them. Make us more mindful of the needs of our fellow man and less absorbed in selfish concerns, that Christ may approve and bless what we do here this day. We ask these blessings in His name. Amen. Please be seated. Councillors, then we move on to bereavements between the 19th of May and today the 15th of June, and as a community we mourn the loss of Alex James Bridge, Graham Thomas Sanson, Marie Betty Story, Rebecca Underwood Flower, Cheryl Ann Stark, Arthur Wharton Armstrong, Raymond Edward Lamb and Julie Karen Stevens. Councillors, executive team and any friends that may be in the gallery, I'd please ask that you be upstanding and join with me in 1 minute silence as we pay our respects to the deceased and extend our condolences to the family and friends of the deceased. Please be seated. Councillors, you'll see from the screen that we have 100% in the room full attendance of elected members, 9 councillors present, and also of our executive team also present. So there are no requirements for a leave of absence. We'll move on to item 5, which is confirmation of previous minutes. And item 5.1 is the ordinary meeting held on Wednesday, the 15th of May, 2022. I'll now call for an elected member to move the motion that the minutes be a true and correct record of the meeting. Thank you, Councillor Moses, and seconded by Councillor Fuller. Councillor Moses, do you wish to speak to the motion?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
We'll now call for elected member who may wish to ask a question or speak against the motion. Councillor Fuller, as a seconder to the motion, you wish to speak?
No, thanks, Mr Mayor.
Be the case, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that unanimously carried. We'll now move on to item 6, which is declarations of interest. I'll start. I have one declaration of interest in relation to item 11.1, and that is the planning proposal to amend the Gunnedah LEP 2012. It's a pecuniary interest, and the reason is I'm a shareholder of the company that owns the land, 415 to 419 Conadilly Street. I'll be removing myself from the chambers for all discussion and debate, and therefore a determination on this item. The Deputy Mayor will assume the chair and will officiate during that particular item. We'll now call for any further declarations of interest in relation to the business paper. Second call. Third final call. No further declarations. Then we'll move along. Item 7, There are no business. Item 8 is a Merrill Minute. Council, as you'll see, I have circulated a Merrill Minute. And with your indulgence, I'll just take you through this, and I'll be moving this Merrill Minute and seeking your support at the end once I explain the Merrill Minute. So it is in two parts, and I'll read what my recommendation is. Excuse me. The first part is that councillors support a letter to be sent to the New South Wales Shadow Minister for Health, Mr Ryan Park MP, seeking a commitment that should there be a change of government at the March 2023 state election, that the new Gunnedah Hospital will be funded and constructed. And the second part, that the new hospital precinct will provide all of the current services, including 48 beds and the inclusion of renal and chemotherapy services. Councillors, the reason that I put this Merrill Minute forward calling for bipartisan support of the construction of the new hospital is that just last night, Council and some councillors were actually in that meeting by New South Wales Health, received an update on the process and program of the new hospital. Part of that conversation was around the timeline. It was indicated that the timeline is consistent with the schedule that we've been given before, which is that construction should be starting in September 2023 with a roughly 12-month construction period, then go through into commissioning. The concern and the reason I put the Merrill Minute forward is that there is a state election set down for the 25th of March next year. There will be a caretaker mode that will come into play 1 month before that, so the middle of February. It would appear that it is highly unlikely, and I've sought comment from our state member who could not confirm that it would happen, highly unlikely that tenders will be called and awarded and a contractor awarded for the construction of the hospital before caretaker mode comes into place. So for security for our community, the reason I put this Merrill Minute forward is to seek that bipartisan approach that no matter, should there be a change of government in March next year, that Gunnedah will still see the construction and therefore have the facility, the health facilities that are required well into the future. So Council, as I put that to you, I will call for a seconder of the motion, which normally don't. Thank you, Councillor Fuller has seconded the motion. I've spoken to the motion, so I'll now call an elected member if you'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Hook.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and congratulations for bringing this before us. There's just a correction in there in item 1. The last line, after election, there's a word so I think that gets deleted.
Yeah, noted.
And a question to you, Mr Mayor, do you think it would be appropriate that we also write to our local current state member reaffirming their commitment if they happen to be re-elected?
Thank you, Councillor Hook. It's my understanding through very regular conversation with our local member and also with Hunter New England health representatives and the New South Wales Health Infrastructure team that gave the presentation last night that won't be required. They are saying that they have committed. It was a 2019 election commitment to build this new facility, and a funding commitment of $53 million that was committed at that point in time. There has been no indication that they're backtracking on that commitment, and while we could seek that, there's nothing to indicate that there isn't a full 100% commitment from the current coalition government to deliver this facility. The reason I put forward the Merrill Minute is quite simply that there may be the situation that there could potentially be a change of government before contracts are awarded, which could put the construction of the new hospital at risk.
Mr Mayor, I do wish to support what Councillor Hook is suggesting. I think that the hospital is too important to the local community for us not to write to seek that reaffirmation.
Councillor MacArthur, we've had one question there. I will go to the seconder of the motion and then I'll ask for further comment. Councillor Fuller, do you wish to speak to the motion as the seconder of the motion?
Yes, I do, Mr Mayor. I was at that meeting last night and I think you've done the best thing that we could have done. My biggest problem was the amount of beds that we were seeking that was on that planning paper last night, and I'm really determined that we stay with 48 beds. We can't go backwards. We're a town going forwards, we're growing, and we need those 48 beds. So I support you 100% in what you've put forward for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, councillor Fuller. I'll now take questions, and councillor MacArthur, you wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So I seek an amendment to the resolution that also includes the current Minister for Health, so that we do get a reaffirmation of that promise. I would note that we're going into some strained economic
Before you
times.
speak to the motion, I'm sorry, councillor MacArthur, could I please ask that you've suggested an amendment? Could I please see the wording for all councillors to see before I ask you to speak to the amendment?
That council supports a letter to be sent to the New South Wales Minister for Health and the New
So
South
item
Wales
3,
Shadow Minister for Health.
Ms Nyes, item 3 on the motion, you said council potential resolution. Yep. So, councillor MacArthur, if you could just maybe slow that down, and
Certainly, we
Ms
don't need a
Nyes will
third
write
element.
that.
The first element's fine. So go back to number 1, that council supports a letter to be sent to the New South Wales Minister for Health and the New South Wales Shadow Minister for Health, and you can include Mr Ryan Park or take him out. So that council supports a letter to be sent to the New South Wales Minister for Health, to add Minister for Health, and and on the next line, seeking.
Councillor Hook, councillor MacArthur has the floor.
Seeking a commitment that, regardless of any change of government, and then delete the words until you get to at the March 2023 state election, if you're happy with that. But I just, as I was saying, it's too important that it not be reaffirmed.
Councillor MacArthur, I'll call for a seconder to that amendment before I ask you to speak to the motion. Can I just have one clarity from you that you're happy with the wording on the screen before I call for a seconder to the amendment? Councillor Huddle, I'll just seek Councillor MacArthur's approval of the wording before I ask for the seconder.
So approved. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor MacArthur. I'll now call for a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Hoddle. So, councillors, we have an amendment that has been suggested, put forward. I'm happy to accept that, so not see that as an amendment. As the mover of the motion, I'll now call for the seconder. Councillor Fuller, you're happy with the amendment?
Mr Mayor, thank you.
Well, councillors, we now have a motion you see before you in 2 parts that has had some slight wordsmith added to that. I'll now call for Councillor MacArthur, give her the opportunity to speak to this new wording.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think I've explained myself enough.
So I'll allow further debate or conversation, councillors, before I put this motion. Is there an elected member who'd like to speak further in support of the motion we see before you? Councillor O'Keefe.
At the risk of prolonging the discussion on this, I'm speaking against the amendment and foreshadowing a further amendment. I agree completely with the intent, but I think maybe Councillor Hook will support me in saying this. I think we should separate the letter to the current Minister for Health. So I think my amendment that I'm foreshadowing would revert to the original wording and add a 3rd dot point and seek to write a letter to the current Minister for Health. I believe we've made it a little bit messy and confused.
So we have a foreshadowed motion and so what we actually have now is a motion and you're foreshadowing an amendment.
I'll just move an amendment because this is now an motion, sorry. I'll move an amendment. And I apologise profusely to Ms Niles because I nearly raised a point of order and suggested earlier that you copy and paste the original wording before we started amending this. So, I suggest you do that now, copy.
As the wording has been typed on the screen, can I suggest that there is also a regional health minister?
You can, and it's duly noted. I'll magically go back in time and correct my foreshadowed now actual amendment.
I object to the messy characterisation.
Councillor O'Keefe, I think we're
Yeah,
looking for further
okay,
direction
so the
from our
first point
secretary.
will be, so it becomes, so I'm reading for your benefit what the original dot point 1 was, that council supports a letter to be sent to the New South Wales Shadow Minister for Health, comma, Mr. Ryan Park MP, comma, and then you can probably just go, you can start deleting now and stop at seeking, that's the next word. Seeking, so now it should read that, seeking commitment that should there be a change of government. That's how I said government, probably. And so, regardless of any change of government, gets deleted. No, at stays. Should there be a change of government at the March 23 state election, that the new, it's the word so that gets deleted, yes, that the new Gunnedah Hospital will be funded and constructed. New dot point 2, so current 2 becomes 3. That council also support a letter to be sent to the New South Wales Minister for Regional Health, comma, the Honourable Bronnie Taylor, MLC, comma, Bronnie. Yeah, Bronnie Taylor, MLC, comma, seeking a commitment that a re-elected New South Wales government would continue I think I've deliberately omitted that word so it's not politicised, that a re-elected New South Wales government would continue to fund and construct the new Gunnedah Hospital. Full stop. And then in dot point 3, go, sorry, so change dot point, we're editing the dot point 3 that was there, so, yep. That both letters, that both letters seek a commitment that yep, that's it. My apologies to all for walking us through that, but I think that's much neater and separates the shadow and current government.
I'm also amenable to these changes, and rather than calling for a seconder to the amendment, I'll ask the seconder to the motion if you're happy with the changes.
I'll accept that, Mr Mayor. Thank
Therefore, it is the motion, councillors, in 3 parts. You see before you the motion. You have heard from Councillor O'Keefe the wording. I won't bother to reread that motion. I'll now ask if there's an elected member who'd like to speak for or against this motion before I put the motion.
Just a question, Mr Mayor, and to the mover of the motion, do you not also want Mr Hazzard as the Minister for Health to be included?
Well, I'm effectively the mover of the motion as it is in the wording, and I'm quite content with the Regional Health Minister who has carriage over regional communities like Gunnedah to have this authority. Are there any further questions or comments, councillors? Not be the case. I'm going to put this motion. All in favour? Aye. I call that unanimously supported. Thank you for that support. Councillors, we'll now move on to item 9, which is the General Manager's reports, and I'll call on Mr Groth to detail his recommendations, starting with his first item, which is 9.1, revote Sister City and Friendly Relationship Funding. Thank you, Mr Groth.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Good evening, councillors and gallery. Pleased to bring this first item, which is essentially seeking a revote of any unspent funds from the Sister Cities program to 22-23 from the current year.
Thank you, Mr Groth. I'll now call for elected member to move that recommendation become the motion. Thank you, Councillor Luke, seconded by Councillor Hook. Councillor Luke, as a mover of the motion, do you wish to speak to the motion?
It seems like a very good idea.
Thank you, Councillor Luke. I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question. Councillor Hook, as a second of the motion, do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Be the case, I'll put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion also unanimously carried. Next item is 9.2, 2022 Local Government New South Wales Annual Conference, the 23rd to the 25th of October this year, 2022. I'll hand back to Mr Groth to detail the recommendation.
This report, councillors, seeks the approval of the Mayor and Deputy Mayor to attend that conference as identified in the report. Pleased to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr Groth. I'll now call for elected member to move the recommendation to become the motion. Thank you, Councillor Fuller, and seconded by Councillor Moses. Councillor Fuller, as a move the motion, do you wish to speak? Sorry, Councillor, could I ask you to please use your microphone?
Sorry, Mr Mayor. Just that we have new councillors on the council and that we're interested in that conference, and some councillors previously that hadn't been. So I'm hoping that we would look at it being open for a couple more to go if they wish to go. Thank you. They may not, but the option be there. Thank you.
Well, Councillor Fuller, we have a motion before us that calls for the Mayor and Deputy Mayor only. Are you suggesting a change to this motion?
Yes, I am, Mr Mayor, if we have other councillors, new councillors, that would like to go. Thank you.
Well, Councillor, I'm sorry, but you have moved this motion in the current form that it is. So if you seek to see a change, I need the wording. So we have a mover and a motion, a mover and a second of the original motion. Is there a suggested amendment from the floor?
Okay.
Councillor Luke.
Basically the same, but the council approved the attendance of the Mayor and Deputy Mayor and 2 further councillors if they desire to attend to the 2022 Local Government New South Wales and blah, blah, blah.
Before I call for a seconder to the amendment, I'll seek clarification from Councillor Luke that you're happy with the wording once it's completed on the screen.
Sorry, Paige.
I'm sorry, but I'm going to have an issue with a resolution of 2 further councillors.
And it should be that council approves the attendance of the deputy mayor, of the mayor and the deputy mayor, and 2 further councillors if they wish to attend the 2022. So we better at the beginning add that on, please.
And if approved, I'll call for nominations. Thank you. Councillor Luke, can I have your confirmation of the wording as you see on the screen? Is your intent?
After 2 further councillors, what words can I use to say? Should they be additionally 2 further councillors? No, that can actually be fine as is.
Thank you, Councillor Luke. Before I call a seconder for the amendment, I will ask the mover of the motion if they're happy to accept the changes. Councillor Fuller?
Yes, I'm happy to, Mr Mayor.
And Councillor Moses, as a seconder, you're happy with the modification to the motion?
Yes, Mr Mayor.
So therefore it now becomes the motion. Councillors, I would like to now call for nominations for these further two positions.
Yeah.
No,
Councillor Luke?
no. So we actually have a motion calling for two further. I want names before I actually call for or put this motion. As we would normally, when there is a recommendation, we ask for the names before we then try to resolve. So I'll call now for some nominations for the two names. So it will be, this will modify the amendment. It will say Mayor, Deputy Mayor and Councillor. I'll call for nominations. Councillor Luke?
I'd like to nominate myself to attend,
There's no
Mr Mayor.
No need for me to ask if you accept that then. Thank you, Councillor Luke. I'll call for further nominations. Councillor McGrath, would you like to nominate somebody, Councillor McGrath? I'll now call for further nominations.
Can I nominate Colleen, please? Oh, Councillor Fuller, please.
Councillor Fuller, do you wish to accept the nomination? Thank you. I'll now call for further nominations for the two positions that are available. I'll call a second time for any further nominations. Third and final call. Okay, so we now have a motion that reads that Council approve the attendance of the Mayor, Deputy Mayor and Councillor McGrath, Councillor Fuller and Councillor Luke to attend. The 2002 Local Government New South Wales Annual Conference from the 23rd of October to the 25th of October in the Hunter Valley. So councillors, that is the motion. I'll just confirmation again, Councillor Fuller and Councillor Moses, you're happy with the wording of the motion before I call for any debate?
Yes, Mr Mayor, thank you.
Yes, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Fuller, do you wish to speak to the motion as the mover?
No, thanks, Mr Mayor.
Do I now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question?
Mr Mayor, I'd like to speak against the motion. I think two representatives from Gunnedah Shire is sufficient to send to that type of a meeting. I think that we have to be very wary of the amount of money we spend on these sort of things, and there are many things that come up through the year, and if we keep sending more than two people or unnecessary amount, I consider people, it certainly does add up. And I think, we have to be careful how we spend our money. I think two's plenty. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hodden. Councillor Moses, as the seconder of the motion, do you wish to speak?
Yes, Mr Mayor, I think the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor and two councillors, it's quite good for them. I went to one in Sydney a few years ago and I learned a lot over the few days I was there. Thank you.
I'll now call for any further comments from elected members that would like to speak against this motion. If there are, Councillor Hoddle, you've spoken once against the motion. I will give an opportunity to further elected members to speak. I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion. Now I'll open the floor if there are no any further comments or questions before I put the motion. Councillor Luke, did you have a question?
I wanted to speak in favour of the motion, Mr Mayor.
I'll allow.
Thank you. I do believe at the last local government annual conference, I think Tamworth Council had 7 attendees at that conference. I have been told that it's quite a good way for serving councillors to actually understand the process and the connection between local government and state government as it follows through. So I am also supportive of the fact that councillors, it is a succession plan. Councillors need to know, make contacts, networking, and I think it's important that all councillors get the opportunity to attend and see how this process works from local government through to the next stage. And the conference is a good opportunity to do so.
Before I give Councillor Fuller the right of reply, I'll now call. Are there any further questions or comments? Councillor Hoddle.
Mr Mayor, can I just ask a question to you? Are there members of staff attending this as well as councillors?
The general the General Manager would normally, and I assume would be also attending this as he has in previous years. Councillor Fuller, would you like a right of reply?
All I'm going to say, Mr Mayor, is that we have a budget for councillors to attend, and I think that we should be able to do this. We've got all the men going, and I think 2 other women. Nothing against men, nothing against women, but I think we should be able to attend as well. Thank you.
And just to seek clarification from the General Manager before I put this motion, I would assume that any extra funds or any funds at all to attend this conference will come from the elected members' budget. I'd seek clarification that is the case and that there is adequate budget for councillors to attend this conference.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. In terms of the adequate budget for the conference, given that this is going to be one of the first resolutions of expenditure in 22-23, there certainly will be the funds there to accommodate it. Essentially, there's no allocation to specific events of councillors' attendance at conferences and forums and so forth. So it's essentially first in, best dressed in terms of what conferences and seminars are attended during a financial year. So there will certainly be the allocation available, or the funding available for this in this event. I also note for councillors' information, given the motion as it exists, when we booked accommodation, the Mayor will actually be covered by LG New South Wales for attendance, and the only accommodation that could be sought was an apartment which would actually accommodate the Deputy Mayor and the 2 other councillors if council chooses to go down that path. So the additional cost will simply be the registration costs. Unfortunately, I'm unaware of what that is. It hasn't been posted on their website as yet, but it's reasonably nominal.
Thank you, Mr Groth. We've had plenty of debate, Council, and lots of wording in motions and changes back and forth, so I think it's now appropriate that I put this motion. And I'll now call for all of those in favour. Against? Declare the motion carried. Moving right along, item 9.3, delegation of authority to the General Manager. I'll now call for the General Manager to detail the recommendation before you in this item 9.3.
Councillors, pleased to commend the recommendation to amend the delegations. Essentially, it's for the General Manager. It's essentially aimed at bringing less reports about minor donations to Council.
Thank you, Mr Groth. I call for elected member to move that recommendation. Thank you, Councillor Fuller, and seconded by Councillor Luke. Councillor Fuller, as the mover of the motion, do you wish to speak?
No, it's a good idea, Mr Mayor, and it'll save a lot more work for the General Manager and everybody else, I think.
Do I have an elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question? Councillor Luke, as the second of the motion, just to speak.
I think, thank you, Mr Mayor. I think we have, throughout the last couple of years, moved towards taking these smaller amounts to council. I do think it's a good idea as well too, so I commend the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Luke. If there's no further debate, I'll put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that unanimously supported. Moving on to item 9.4, writing off of rates and charges 2021 to 2022. I'll hand back to Mr Groth to detail that recommendation.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and as has been outlined, this is about writing off $65,000, $340.27 under clause 131 of the Local Government Regulation 2021. Commend it and pleased to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr Groth. Once again, I'll call for elected member to move the recommendation to become the motion. Thank you, Councillor Luke, as the mover of the motion, and seconded by Councillor Fuller. Councillor Luke, as the mover of the motion, do you wish to speak to the motion?
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and to ask a question, if I can. Writing off a debt that's 5 years old, because we've written it off, doesn't mean that it's not still a debt that we can be paid should the debtor still pay that amount?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Luke. It would remove the debt against the ratepayer. So these are, as they're postponed rates, they're amounts we cannot recover. And this is a formality in terms of writing off those postponed rates, those rates and charges. There is, as the author of the report has identified in the report, There is no impact on councillors' budget, however, because we provide for those postponed rates as a doubtful debt at the time they're raised.
Thank you.
Now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Fuller is the second to the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No thanks, Mr Mayor.
There's no further debate, councillors. I'll put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that unanimously carried. Moving on, item 9.5, investments. I'll hand back to Mr Groth to detail that recommendation.
Councillors, pleased to provide the investment report as required under the Act, detailing $80.6 million in all funds, and pleased to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr Groth. Thank you, Councillor MacArthur has moved and Councillor Moses has seconded. Councillor MacArthur has moved the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Moses, as the seconder to the motion, do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Be the case then, councillors, I'll put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that unanimously supported. Thank you for your contribution, Mr Groth, to the June ordinary meeting of council. We'll now move on, councillors, to item 10 in your business papers, and that is the Acting Director of Corporate and Community Services reports. And I'll call on Ms McLean to detail the recommendations of her report, starting at item 10.1, capital revote of funds for the civic stage construction and reinforcement.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you, I'm pleased to commend the recommendation that Council endorse the revote of $24,500 for the unspent funds for the civic stage construction reinforcement to the 2022-23 capital works budget. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll call for a mover. Thank you. Councillor Hook has moved that recommendation to become the motion and seconded by Councillor Moses. Councillor Hook, as a mover of the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
I'll call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a further question. Councillor Moses is the seconder to the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Be the case, I'll put this motion. All in favour? Against? Unanimously supported. Thank you. Moving on to item 10.2, donation facility hire support fund for Parkinson's Support Group, and I'll hand back to Ms McLean to detail the recommendation before you.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you, I'm pleased to commend the recommendation that a donation to the Gunnedah Parkinson's Support Group of $655 be made in the form of a contribution from the Facility Hire Support Fund towards hiring costs of the Civic, and that those funds are drawn from the 2021-22 existing Facility Hire Support Fund from the Social Planning Operational Budget to cover costs incurred by venues.
Thank you. I'll now call for elected member. Thank you. Councillor Fuller has moved that motion and Councillor MacArthur has seconded that motion. Councillor Fuller, as a mover, do you wish to speak to it?
No thanks, Mr Mayor.
Do I have an elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against this motion? Councillor MacArthur is a second to the motion. Do you wish to speak?
I'd just say that it's a worthy cause, it's a one-off donation, and I'd like to attend because there's a lack of information around Parkinson's and motor neurone disease, and we have residents in the Shire that need that vital information. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor MacArthur. And before I put this motion, councillors, I would also like to support this, having been very close to a loved one who actually went through the final years of his life, my father-in-law, and suffered terribly because of Parkinson's disease. And I know the impact not only personally on him, but also the family and the support that necessarily wasn't there for family. I think this is very important, and I'm also hoping that there'll be further support from my fellow elected members when I put this motion. Councillor Hoddle, would you like to speak?
Mr Mayor, I'd like to speak for the motion in support of it, and a really worthwhile thing for people that suffer from Parkinson's disease, and I know of a few in our community. And I'd also point out that Professor Heath Eckroyd, I think, is an old student from St Mary's, so it's quite appropriate to have someone of that expertise come to Gunnedah and talk, and of course we will hopefully pass it. We'll be able to help them with a fee for the Civic, which will bring people in from a way across the region, Narrabri, Weewar, probably further, who are probably suffering from Parkinson's disease. So I think it's a really good initiative, and I think we should support it.
Councillors, that being said, I think it's appropriate now that I put this motion. All in favour? And I'll call that unanimously supported. Thank you. Moving on, item 10.3, Local Government Remuneration Tribunal, and I'll hand back to Mr McLean to detail the recommendation before him.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you, I'm pleased to commend the recommendation that pursuant to section 241 of the Local Government Act, the annual mayoral allowance be $27,600 effective from 1 July for the ensuing 12-month period, and pursuant to the same section, the annual councillor fees be $12,650 effective from 1 July for the ensuing 12-month period. And that's a 2% increase. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McLean. I'll now call for elected member to move the recommendation become the motion. Thank you, Councillor Luke, seconded by Councillor McGrath. Councillor Luke, as a mover of the motion, you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
I now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question. Councillor McGrath, as a second of the motion, you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Councillors, if there's no debate, then I'd like to put this motion. All in favour? Against? Being no against, I'll call that unanimously supported. Moving on to item 10.4, which is Switch 2022 Annual Conference of the New South Wales Public Library Association. I'll hand back to Ms McLean to detail the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you, I'm pleased to condone the recommendation that Council endorse Councillor Luke as delegate to attend the Switch 2022 Annual Conference of the New South Wales Public Libraries Association from 8 to 10 November 2022. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll now call for elected member to move that recommendation. Councillor McGrath has moved. Councillor Fuller has seconded that motion. Councillor McGrath, as a mover of the motion, you wish to speak to that motion?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. You're certainly going to be busy, Councillor Luke. Have fun.
I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Fuller, as a seconder to the motion, do you wish to speak?
Thank you.
If there's no further debate, councillors, before I put this motion, I too would like to add my thank you and gratitude to Councillor Luke over an extended period of time. Councillor Luke has provided her service as one of our elected members for the library to support our library in all of the actions, and of course our very dedicated staff at the library. So on behalf of the rest of the elected members, Councillor Luke, thank you for that commitment, but also thank you for nominating to attend and represent us at this very important conference. In saying that, councillors, I'd now like to put the motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that also unanimously supported. We're all getting on very well today. It's great. Next item is 10.5, Outstanding Resolution Register, and I'll hand back to Ms McLean to detail the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you, I'm pleased to commend a recommendation that the Outstanding Resolution Register is received and noted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McLean, and I'll now call for elected member to move the recommendation and become the motion. Thank you, Councillor Hoddle, and seconded by Councillor Hook. Councillor Hoddle, as the mover of the motion, do you wish to speak to the motion?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor. I think we've been through this register quite thoroughly as a council. Thank you.
I now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a further question. Councillor Hook, as a seconder of the motion, do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Well, councillors, if there's no debate, then I'll put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that also unanimously supported. Councillors, thank you, Ms McLean, for your contribution to our June meeting. Councillors, the next item is item 11, Director of Planning and Environmental Services report. I have a declaration of interest in relation to this first item, 11.1, so I will now be removing myself as it's pecuniary interest from the chambers. The Deputy Mayor will now assume the chair and he will take us through the discussion and any debate and therefore a determination before I re-enter the chambers. Thank you.
Thank you, councillors. Can the record show that Councillor Chaffey has left the chambers? Councillors, before you we have item 11.1, planning proposal to amend the Gunnedah Local Environmental Plan 2012, planning proposal for lot ADP 3604 93, Lot B DP 372051 and Lot A DP 405072, 415 to 419 Coladilly Street, Gunnedah. And I'd like to hand over to Mr Groth to outline his recommendation.
Thanks, Mr Deputy Mayor. I'll take that one. Councillors, this report seeks endorsement of a draft planning proposal, as you would have read in your business paper. The property in question is 415 to 419 Coladilly Street. The planning proposal seeks two things, essentially. The first is to allow what we call an additional permitted use on those lots only, and that permitted use that the developer is seeking is hotel or motel accommodation. And the other thing it seeks to do is to remove the floor space ratio, again, just for those lots in question, not for other land around. And the proposal, according to the planning proposal, will ultimately lead to, or the development will ultimately lead to a 4.5-star motel and function centre on the site. Motel accommodation is generally considered consistent with residential in terms of its nature, in terms of its impact on adjoining owners. And the main street location really does lend itself to this development, hence the support for the planning proposal. Having no floor space ratio is very consistent with other zones that permit this type of development. Be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr Johns. Do I have a mover for the motion? Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe, seconded by Councillor Luke. Councillor O'Keefe.
Briefly, Mr Deputy Mayor, it's fantastic to see development and proposal to clean up one of the entrances to town and get that vacant land working for the good of Gunnedah.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. Do I have a councillor who wishes to ask a question or speak against the motion? Councillor Luke, as seconder of the motion, you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor.
Then there's no further debate. Before I put the motion, this particular one, I'd like a show of hands, please. All of those councillors in favour? I call that unanimous. Thank you very much. And someone call the Mayor back into the chambers, please. And may the record show that Councillor Chappie has returned to chambers.
Thank you, councillors. I'll now assume the chair. And moving on to the next item on the agenda, which is item 11.2, 2021-22 capital revote, employment, land use strategy, building, environment and strategic projects. And I'll hand back to Mr Johns to detail the recommendation.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. And through you, councillors, as you would have read in this report, we seek a revote of funds from the current financial year to next financial year to allow us to complete the employment land strategy.
Thank you, Mr Johns. I'll now call for elected member to move the recommendation become a motion.
Mr Mayor, I'd actually like to move the officer's recommendations in item 11.2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 in globo.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll now call for any elected member who'd like to deal with any of these particular items in isolation. Otherwise, I'll call for a seconder for all of these motions to be called individually. Councillor Moses, do you have one of the items you'd like to deal with in separation?
No, I'd like to second all of them together. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, I'll ask and afford the opportunity of elected members if there's one of the particular items that councillor needs to discuss or debate in isolation. No? So we have a mover in Councillor O'Keefe and a seconder of Councillor Moses. Then in globo, we are now councillors, so you are all completely understanding. We're dealing with items 11.2 all the way through to 11.7 as one. And in saying that, I would now like to, before I call for Councillor O'Keefe to speak to that motion, go back to the Director of Planning and Environmental Services to articulate anything in particular in relation to those items that he'd like to share with councillors before we start the debate.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. And through you, councillors, as you would have read in the report, essentially this is allowing us to move money from the current financial year to the next financial year to complete things that we weren't able to complete in the current financial year. Probably the only thing that I wouldn't speak to is that there has been a bit of a rejig in item 11.7, which relates to small grants, and that's essentially some reallocation of funds from different 356 grant funds to from one to another. But again, if you had questions about that, I would have heard from you by now. Thank you.
Right, thank you, councillors. We've heard from the Director in relation to all items 11.2 through to 11.7. We have a motion and we have a seconder to that motion. I'm now going to ask Councillor O'Keefe if he'd like to speak to the motion.
Only to say that I feel like it would have been quicker to do them one at a time at this point.
I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question. Councillor Moses, as the seconder of the motion, do you wish to speak to the motion?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Well, councillors, if there's no debate, it sounds like it's time for me to put the motion, so I will. All of those in favour? Aye. And against? Unanimously supported. Thank you, Mr Johns, for your contribution to our June meeting so far, noting that you have some items enclosed for us to attend to. Next, councillors, we'll move along to item number 12, which is the Director of Infrastructure Services reports, and I'll call on Mr Bartlett to detail his recommendations, starting with item 12.1, which is Capital Revote Playground Equipment Replacement Program. Thank you, Mr Bartlett.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is to seek Council's endorsement to revote the 2021-2022 Capital Works allocation for Playground Equipment Replacement Program to the 22-23 financial year.
Thank you, Mr Bartlett. I now call for elected member to move that recommendation to become a motion.
Mr Mayor, I'll have a go again and move item 12.1, 12.2, 12.4 in globo, which are the three revotes relevant to this director's reports.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. Before I call for a seconder, I will ask the elected members if there's any one of these particular three items that a councillor or elected member would like to discuss or debate individually. If there are none, councillors, I will now call for a seconder to that motion. Thank you. So we have a mover of Councillor O'Keefe and a seconder of Councillor MacArthur. And I'll call now on Mr Bartlett to give us any information he feels we may need to know in relation to items 12.1, 2 and 4.
Nothing further to add, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. So, Councillor O'Keefe, I'll now like to ask you if you'd like to speak to your motion.
We're getting better. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question. Councillor MacArthur is the second of the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Be the case, I'll put this motion. All in favour? Against? Unanimously carried. Thank you, councillors. We're now down to item 12.3, which is the Gunnedah Shire Open Space Strategy 2022 to 2032 adoption. I'll call on Mr Bartlett to detail the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is to seek the adoption of the Gunnedah Shire Open Space Strategy 2022 to 2032. I'd like to commend the efforts of staff and a number of those involved in the development of this strategy over the last 18 months to 2 years now. It's been a very significant effort that's involved significant community consultation, and I'd commend the report to Council.
Thank you, Mr Bartlett. I'll now call for elected member to move the recommendation to become the motion. Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe, seconded by Councillor Moses. Councillor O'Keefe, do you wish to speak to the motion as mover?
I'm confident I've put this on the public record at a previous meeting, but the prior open space strategy was one of the first strategies or lengthy council documents I read when first elected, I don't know, 5.5, 6 years ago, 2016, whenever that was. It was a long time ago. I've aged significantly, put on a fair bit of weight too. May or may not be directly related to serving on this council. But anyway, it was something that, you know, updating that and seeking to understand why the 2010 strategy hadn't been fully realised, you know, became a bit of a pet or passion project for myself on council. And certainly, you know, I've had sleepless nights stressing that I will no longer be alive, let alone serving on council, when we get to the point that we're adopting the updated open space strategy. And it's not through lack of effort, as the director has said. Unfortunately, or fortunately, sorry, fortunately our council has a measurable amount of open space. Well, it's actually measurable, it's in the plan, but it's a lot of open space, okay? And we have a fantastic public resource that we manage. I've had to remind myself and relearn exactly what should go into a council strategy numerous times in this process, and remember that it's the framework for us to go and prosecute master planning and improvements and service delivery for our community. So I commend the document to all. It is all encompassing, therefore it is broad. It won't necessarily answer every question, but it's certainly the framework for this Shire to move forward and yield some great results for our community.
Thank you, Councillor. I now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a question. Councillor Hoddle.
Mr Mayor, could I ask Mr Bartlett? I should know the answer to this question, but I don't. It's the open strategy for 2022 to 2032. Does that enable us to revisit this document and put some amendments in as times change?
Thank you, Councillor Hoddle, for the question, and through you, Mr Mayor. The document should be considered by Council and the community as a live document. It can be revisited at any time. However, I would suggest that only occur with further community consultation.
Councillor Moses, second to the motion, used to speak.
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Now call for any further questions or comments from the floor from elected members. Councillor McGrath, did you have your hand up earlier?
I did. Thank you for prompting me, Mr Mayor. Yeah, my question was essentially answered within the answer to Councillor Hoddle. I was simply just going to invite Mr Bartlett to commit to continuing that engagement and consultation process, which has been so robust throughout putting this plan together. Yeah, I certainly won't break Murray's heart by trying to postpone or prolong anything. And I just want to put on the record my disappointment, I suppose, that the sale of McDonagh Park, like the secret park in George Street, is still on there. Other than that, I think it's wonderful and I'm so pleased that it's completed.
Thank you, Councillor McGrath. I don't think technically we've heard a councillor speak against the motion, but I will refer to Councillor O'Keefe to see if he would like a right of reply before I put this motion.
I think we've established that our right of reply will exist forever with this living document.
Be the case, councillors, I'd now like to put this motion. All in favour? Aye. Against? Unanimously supported. Councillors, we'll now move on to item 12.5, which is Quarries DA update, and I'll hand back to Mr Bartlett to detail that recommendation.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is to seek approval to transfer $330,000 from the Quarry Operations Restricted Asset to a project to obtain development approval for the expansion of 2 of our existing quarry operations. The project includes development of a new development application, updating existing DAs, supported by site-specific management plans, including decommissioning and rehabilitation plans for each quarry.
Thank you, Mr Bartlett. I'll now call for elected member to move the recommendation to become the motion. Thank you, Councillor Hoddle, seconded by Councillor McArthur. Councillor Hoddle, as a mover of the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor McArthur, as the seconder of the motion, do you wish to speak to the motion?
Only to emphasise how important our roads network is. So more gravel means hopefully better service to unsealed roads. Thank you.
There's no further debate, councillors. I'll put this motion. All in favour? Against? Unanimously supported. Next item on the agenda, councillors, is item 12.6, request for funding, asset disposal, 46 to 52 Bloomfield Street. And I'll hand back to Mr Bartlett to detail that recommendation.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you. The purpose of this report is to seek Council's approval for the transfer of funding from General Fund for the amount of $44,885, including GST, to dispose of assets and return 46 to 52 Bloomfield Street to a natural state.
Thank you, Mr Bartlett. Now calling for elected member to move that recommendation to become a motion. Thank you, Councillor Hook, seconded by Councillor Luke. Councillor Hook, as a mover of the motion, do you wish to speak to it?
I think it's going to be money well spent to clean up that area, and I fully support it.
Now call for elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against this motion. Councillor Luke is the second to the motion, just to speak.
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Councillors, I'll now put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion carried. Moving on, item 12.7, which is the Gunnedah Local Traffic Advisory Committee, and I'll hand back to Mr Bartlett to detail the recommendation before you.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you, the purpose of this report is to advise Council of 12 recommendations made by the Gunnedah Local Traffic Advisory Committee following its meeting held on 6th of May 2022.
Thank you, Mr Bartlett. I now call for elected member. Thank you, Councillor Moses, as the mover of the motion and also a representative on that committee, and seconded by Councillor Hook. Thank you. Councillor Moses, as the mover, do you wish to speak?
Yes, Mr Mayor, this motion that's up here, it's all straightforward. I don't think we have to debate much of it. Thank you.
I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against the motion or ask a question. Councillor Hook is the second to the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Well, councillors, before I put this motion, I'd just like to say I think this committee is one that's been long-standing within our community and has representatives right across our community on there. I'm very happy with a lot of the points, the 12 points that are put forward there. Some of those are quite exciting in relation to AgQuip and NightQuip happening again this year and roads closed, and also in celebration of NAIDOC and the hill climb. So all important activities on our calendar of events, but also importantly areas from our community that have come forward to council through this committee that are potential concerns within our community that we are actually looking at addressing and have assessments being done in relation to road safety. So I commend the work, the report, but also Councillor Moses for his commitment, long-standing commitment to this particular committee of council. In saying that, councillors, I'd now like to put the motion. All in favour? Aye. Against? I'll call that unanimously supported. And Mr Bartlett, thank you for your contribution to our ordinary meeting, noting that you still have some items in close to come. Councillors, the next item is 13, which is reports to committee. 13.1 is audit committee meeting minutes held on Thursday the 19th of May. Councillors, you'll see in your report, and I'll just go to the report. If you bear with me. The audit report, you'll see the details there, Councillor MacArthur being our representative and all of those present and the items that were listed. So now, councillors, I call for a elected member to move motion that they be accepted. True and correct? Councillor MacArthur moving the motion, seconded by Councillor Luke. Thank you. Councillor MacArthur, do you wish to speak to the motion?
Now, there's no further explanation necessary, but could I ask that my attendance be marked as present at the moment the cross is next to councillor rather than my name? Thank you.
Thank you. Noted. We'll see that that change is made. I now call for elected member who'd like to ask a question. Councillor Luke is the second of the motion. Do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Be the case, and I'll put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion carried. Moving on, next item is delegates' reports. We have one, item 14.1, New South Wales Libraries Association North East Full Zone meeting on May. And I'll call Councillor Luke is our delegate there, and Councillor Luke will be moving this motion, and I'd now like to call on Councillor Luke to give some detail of her report before I call for a seconder to the motion.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I was actually a member of the of this committee in 2016-17, but was unable to attend. Councillor Swain has been was the delegate for the last couple of years of the last term of council. It was nice to be able to get back into this role and be able to attend these meetings. In my delegates report, I thought it was a good opportunity to also include some information that my fellow councillors might be interested in. Hopefully it was succinct and to the point, and I then recommend my my report. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Luke. I'll call for a seconder to Councillor Luke's report and motion, therefore. Thank you, Councillor Hook. I'll now call for elected member who'd like to ask a question of Councillor Luke in relation to the report. Councillor Hook is a seconder to the report. Would you like to speak?
I'd like to congratulate you, Councillor Luke, on a very succinct report, and one that had some quite enlightening figures in it that may well serve us in the future when we're looking for funding for the civic precinct. So we'll keep those in mind. Thank you.
Well, councillors, if there's no further debate, I'll put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion unanimously supported. Councillors, next item is 15, notice of motion, question on notice. We have two, and they are both from Councillor Hook, and I'll afford Councillor Hook an opportunity to speak to these shortly. Firstly, councillors, I'll start with item 15.1, which is notice of motion, Sealed Road, Showground. And the notice of motion, as penned by Councillor Hook, reads that council investigate options with costings to ameliorate perceived risk to horse and rider when crossing the tarred road to access the Camp Draft Softball Arena at the showground. A report is presented to a future council meeting of council. And now Councillor Hook obviously will move that motion. I will give Councillor Hook the opportunity to speak to that motion before I call for a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Hook.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillors are probably aware that there's a number of members of the community, and specifically related to the Show Society, members of the Show Society, who have a lot to do with horses, and specifically the Camp Draft section. They were showing concern that they had some perceived risks around the tarred area that was put around behind the Camp Draft and Softball Arena area, that they might cause slippage to horses. Now, it's been relayed to me that a horse walking in a straight line, really there is no risk. But if a horse happens to shy or play up in any particular way, it becomes a very, very slippery surface. And I happen to have some experience of this myself, and any of people who have driven stock across a tarred road will know that they can quite easily fall. This is really trying to ameliorate any risk that may be associated to council and to council property. And I brought this forward to council because I feel that it is our duty to look at every avenue to ameliorate that risk. I know there's been some work actually been done, and the Director of Infrastructure Services has indicated that some work is probably in process at the moment. But I bring this to council just so that it is on the record, and that council has the opportunity to do what it feels is necessary to ameliorate any risk and any further risk that happens to be felt by any user group. Well, it's probably up to them to actually assess that risk before they put on any event. So I recommend this motion to council. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hook. I now call for a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Fuller has seconded that motion. I'll now call for elected member who'd like to ask a question or speak against this notice of motion. Councillor MacArthur.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you, I just would like to propose an amendment to the resolution so that we also include access by livestock and handlers to the showground main arena. If you have a look at the showground site, it's in between the Secretary's office and the grandstand. It is a gravel access, and it's on quite a steep incline. So what you have are cattle who are part of the cattle pavilion area at the bottom of the showground, and to access the showground and participate in the grand parade, they are led across the tarred road and then up the gravel driveway to get to the main arena. So I would like to see that investigated as well with similar perceived risk. But the change I would add is to ameliorate the perceived risk to livestock and their handlers when crossing the tarred road and using the gravel driveway to access the showground. And I think they really are the two accesses to the main arena.
Before I ask you to speak to that amendment, I'll first and therefore call for a seconder to your amendment. I'll now call on the mover and the seconder whether they're happy to accept the changes of word.
Just,
Mr Mayor, I'm not happy to accept the amendment. We've got
Okay, that's
something
all I
very,
need to
very
know.
specific.
That's all I need to know. So now we actually have an amendment.
no, point of
Portia.
order, actually, Mr Mayor, too, because the reason I raised the other areas of access was that there could be other entrances to the showground of relevance to the resolution.
Well, Councillor MacArthur, we have a notice of motion from an elected member that has specific wording. You're suggesting, I don't think there's a point of order, you're suggesting a change of wording. There is actually a notice of motion that has a mover of the notice of motion and a seconder. So if you want to see changes, it will be an amendment. You've articulated that. We have it on the screen. I'll now call for a seconder to your amendment of the notice of motion before we continue on with any further debate. So, councillors, you'll see the wording, and that wording is that council investigate options with costings to ameliorate perceived risk to livestock and their handlers when crossing the tarred road and using the gravel road driveway to access the camp draft and softball arena at the showground. A report to be presented to a future meeting of council. That's not your wording?
No, because we only need access to the showground, not the camp draft softball arena.
Okay, so we'll just have that changing, Councillor MacArthur, and I'll come back to you for clarification of the wording, as it now will be an amendment if there's a seconder.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Mayor.
What's your point of order?
It's a new motion and not an amendment, and you can deal with it if you that way. I think that's the appropriate way to deal with it.
Well, I don't believe you can bring a new motion to a council meeting now. I think an amendment to the current motion is the only way that this can be dealt with. I'll seek clarification from the General Manager if it is too different from the original notice of motion to be dealt with today.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If the motion is excluding horse and rider accessing camp draft and softball, then the softball arena, then I would suggest it'd be a direct negative of the original motion. If the amendment was appropriately worded to include that intent and simply add livestock and handlers to the arena, then I think it'd be a valid amendment.
Thank you for that clarification. I'll seek advice from Councillor MacArthur if you'd like to amend any wording of your amendment as we see it on the screen before we consider if we're going to progress any further.
The purpose of the motion, as I understand it, is to alleviate the perceived risk to anybody, whether it's horse and rider or livestock and handler, accessing areas of the showground. So I would suggest it, from an audit and risk perspective, be dealt with as part of this motion, as suggested by Councillor Hook. So I consider it would fall into the second aspect that the General Manager referred to.
My reading and listening to the General Manager's perspective on the particular wording, I don't believe that to be true. I don't think, from what I've heard from Councillor Hook, that is the intent. I think it is specifically to do with horse and rider and on camp draft and softball arena. Councillor Hook, I'll ask for your clarification. That's the case.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. All of the complaints and concerns revolve specifically around the softball arena camp draft area in relationship to the new tar road that was put down. There has been no concerns raised to my knowledge about any other access to the showground from other regions. As a point of probably clarification, there is going to be Showground User Group Committee meeting on Tuesday next week, and I think any other concerns about safety can be addressed at that meeting, and recommendations from that committee can then be brought forward to the relevant officer, and then a recommendation can come back to council if any other changes need to be made. I really do not support that amendment. Thank you.
Well, that being the case, I guess I need to determine that I believe that this amendment is out of order, so we won't be dealing with it at this council meeting. Councillors, we have a notice of motion, as you see in the wording, the original wording that reads that council investigate options with costings to ameliorate perceived risk to horse and rider when crossing the tarred road to access the Camp Draft softball arena at the showground. A report to be presented to a future council meeting. We have a mover of Councillor Hook and a seconder of Councillor Fuller. Councillor MacArthur, I acknowledge your words and would encourage you to consider at a future meeting maybe notice of motion or some further wording. So in saying that now, councillors, I'd like to afford Councillor Fuller as a seconder of the motion an opportunity to speak to the motion.
Well, I think it's all been said, Mr Mayor, and I totally agree with you, Councillor Hook. Those problems that have been addressed is what has been put to several councillors, so thank you.
I'd now like to give an opportunity to elected member who'd like to ask a further question or speak against this motion. Thank you, Councillor Hoddle.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I would like to speak strongly against this motion for several reasons. It has to be acknowledged that this council has spent a lot of money on the showground and it is in a better state than it was 3 years ago, but it's got further to go. One of the improvements, besides doing the fence and the lighting and the audio and every other thing it's done there, is to put a bitumen road round. Now, it's obviously popular with some people and others don't like it. From what I gather, speaking to members of that camp drafting fraternity, some of them do like it. In fact, the comment was that the ground was probably the best it's ever been. They liked the grass surface and really the bitumen road was not an issue. I mean, if you want to eliminate issues, don't ride a horse. I mean, there is always going to be a point of danger with livestock, so it's there. What I suggest we do, and I've already done this, is to take this matter to the Showground Trust Committee, which meets on Tuesday, as Councillor Hook just said. Get them to thrash it out against themselves, have the people, all the user groups are there, and they can in that room tell council what they think about the bitumen road. But it'll be interesting to find out what they do, but I think that's the place for it. And then if there's perceived a risk, or Councillor MacArthur might like to involve the Show Society to provide better access for cattle going to the arena, as she's suggesting, well, all those matters can come through to council. But the purpose of having that committee, which hasn't met for a considerable amount of time, is to advise council. And I think in this case, council does need advice because there are a lot of people that like the bitumen road and there are others that don't like it. And I'm told also that the council's own health and safety officer, who is also a horse person, has said it's no more perceived risk than any other road. So, you know, we need to get to the bottom of this and make the right decision, and I don't think we have the information. Let that committee deal with it on Tuesday, and they'll provide a recommendation to council. Thank you.
Thank you, councillors. We've had some debate. Now I think it's appropriate that I afford the opportunity of the mover of this notice of motion, Councillor Hook, an opportunity for a right of reply.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Look, firstly, I understand the intent of Councillor McGrath. Sorry, Councillor. Councillor MacArthur, but I thought that was appropriate. Councillor Hoddle, I see exactly where you're coming from, and I do have some personal sympathy with what you're saying. However, I know what these committees are like, and you're going to get out of these user groups, you're going to get maybe 2 people that have got some sensible debate in this particular area. I'm sure that people that are with the pottery club, with the basketball club, etc., are really not going to have any valuable input into that particular discussion. The whole purpose behind this is that there was some concern from a particular user group of the showground about this particular section of the roadway. Now, I don't think we're asking for a huge amount of money to be spent here. it may well have already been spent insofar as that there's already been sand put in 2 access points across the tarred road. That may be all that is necessary. However, it has been flagged that there is a perceived danger in this particular area, and I think that it's up to council not to leave it for somebody else to make a decision that then comes back to council at a later date. I think we can address it now, and I think we have got enough expertise within our staff and within the directorate to be able to do some very, very quick investigations, some desktop investigations, and come up with a recommendation to a future council. And I'm sure it will not be very, very hard to come up with something that is simple fix. I can't see it being probably anything more than a bit more sand across that particular area and maybe a little bit of signage at the most. But the main thing is that there has been an area of perceived danger. There is an element of risk, and there is, as Councillor Hoddle said, there is an element of risk in everything we do, especially with horse riding. But having members of the public saying that there is a risk there, I think it is up to us to address it, to get it out in the open so that everybody knows where we stand. So I strongly recommend that we pass this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hook and councillors. We've had plenty of debate. I think we all understand the issue at hand, so I'm now going to put the motion. As you see the wording on the screen, all of those in favour, by show of hands, I declare that motion carried. Thank you. Moving on. Next item on the agenda is item 15.2, notice of motion, airport cross strip. We have a motion also from Councillor Hook, or a notice of motion that reads in 3 parts. First part, the council investigate the feasibility of keeping the cross strip at the airport as part of the aerodrome upgrade. 2, the assessment to take into consideration the safety implications to aircraft operations from an aviation safety expert if the cross strip is to be permanently decommissioned. And 3, that option including re-establishment of the cross strip at a later date if funding precludes this work being included in the current body of works. Now, this is moved by Councillor Hook. Before I call for a seconder, I'll afford Councillor Hook the opportunity to speak to this notice of motion.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you for indulging me, fellow councillors. You'll be sick of me by the end of the evening. You know my personal probably feelings, and I've spoke to council in this matter before in another forum, that personally I'm not sure whether we really need a cross strip. However, it's not what I feel. I'm representing a group of people out at the airport, predominantly the Aero Club, and there's a training group out there as well from recreational aviation, who feel that there is safety issues and risk involved that they believe is not in their best interests if the cross strip is actually taken out of service. And I think that they're strongly advocating that the cross strip remain for a number of reasons. One being that it is extremely good training for them to be able to land on shorter strips, on grass strips. Tail dragger aircraft, there are a few of them out there. They perform better, and there's better landing practice for them on grass strips. The other thing is that specifically to more of lighter aircraft, they tell me that once you get a certain degree of crosswind on the main runway, then it becomes very, very difficult to land. So an aircraft may have taken off in adequate conditions, and they come back and they find that the wind has changed and they've got a very, very strong crosswind on the main runway. Therefore, they have the option of landing on the grass cross strip. And they feel that that is something that is a real safety issue for them. Taking off is not the problem, but it's landing in inclement conditions where the main runway doesn't afford them a safe landing. So under those circumstances, I felt that it was prudent that we at least investigate the possibility of maintaining the cross strip. If it can't be done within the current budget, which I assume it may not be able to be done, then possibly it could be done at a later date if funding becomes available to do so. So that's my base argument for this motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Hook. I'll now call for a seconder to the motion. Councillor MacArthur is seconding that motion. Okay, Councillor Hook, thank you for explaining your notice of motion. I'll now call for elected member who'd like to speak against this motion or ask a further question. Councillor McGrath.
Just a question. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And perhaps it's better addressed to Mr. Bartlett as director of that particular area. I was just curious if you could, Councillor Hook mentioned the Aero Club and the recreational training. Is that what they're called? Yeah. Are there any other user groups currently using the airport? Or the airport in general?
Thank you, Councillor MacArthur, for the question, and through you, Mr. Mayor.
Yes,
There are a number of user groups or number of users of the facility. Exactly who and in what numbers, I don't have that information on hand, but there are more users other than just the Aero Club.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. Councillor MacArthur, do you wish to speak as a seconder to the motion?
Quite done.
You've asked a question. I'll come back to you, Councillor McGrath, for further questions if you so desire. Councillor MacArthur is the second to the motion. Do you wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And again, I have personal experience with my son flying at the Gunnedah Airport. I think it's incumbent on us to investigate the safety options and to have an aviation expert advise us before we make a decision about what is pretty critical, safety in the air. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor MacArthur. Councillor McGrath, I take note that you'd like a further question, but firstly I'll give an opportunity to fellow elected members. Are there any fellow elected member who would like to ask a further question or speak against this motion?
Ask a question through you, Mr. Mayor. In discussion on this topic and backwards and forwards elected members, I guess we've all been reminded that we started master planning for the aerodrome in possibly 2016 and didn't actually finish that process. And from memory, one of the reasons we stopped that process was seeking or awaiting funding or identification of funding streams, which we've gone down the path there and got some funding and got some things happening to keep the airstrip functioning. I'm aware that the resolution before us is seeking to address a acute issue which is developed, but I guess the point of my question is, does the officer believe that we should be dealing with this acute issue, or would be better off actually bringing a motion to seek to revisit the master plan and get that resolved, for lack of a better term, as a shire or a council?
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe, for the question, and through you, Mr. Mayor. Ultimately, that's a decision for the elected council as to which way council would like to proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett and Councillor O'Keefe, for your question. Councillor McGrath, I'm happy to come back to you now. Do you have a further question?
Yeah, actually, I don't know whether it's a question. Councillor O'Keefe, I think, covered a lot of what I was sort of wanting to get at. I suppose I just have concerns that there's already been a fair bit invested there, and I feel like we're perhaps being drawn into making quite reactive decisions. And I also have concerns that we're essentially just subsidising a very expensive hobby. So I guess and that may be incorrect, but to alleviate those concerns, certainly I think exploring a planning approach rather than simply passing a motion might be a better way to proceed.
Thank you, Councillor McGrath. Councillor Hook, would you like Councillor Hoddle, you'd like to ask a question? You'd like to speak for the motion, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The airport is an essential part of infrastructure in terms of emergencies and its and business in the town. It is an essential. It's not just something that people play on. We've had a debate on this over the last few months. We've been told that the cross strip's too near the town, that the planes are going to danger houses or something, and I'd like to know the facts of that. We've also been told that it's a way of light operators avoiding a camera so they don't have to pay a landing fee. I think we need to get to the bottom of this. We need expert advice. We need CASA's advice as to whether you can close that and then with the view of reopening it again. I'd imagine that would be extremely difficult because they publish books about what runways are open and what are closed. I think there's a very strong safety issue in this because of crosswinds, and that's when they need the grass strip. So I'll support Rob's motion because in it he asks for an assessment from experts, and I think we should get that and return this back to the council. So I support Rob's motion, Councillor Hook's motion. Thank you.
Thank you, councillors. We've had a debate for and against, so now I'd like to give Councillor Hook the opportunity to have a right of reply to his notice of motion.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Look, I don't have much more to add, but to Councillor McGrath, and I get the right person this time, probably you were asking about the number of user groups out there. There's approximately 75 members of the Aero Club, so it's a significant group of people. We've got Angel Flight out there. They operate, as Michael Barnier, he operates Angel Flight as a private pilot. So he donates his services to take people to and from. And I know there's been instances where he's had to use the cross strip. He's taken people down for emergency treatment in Sydney and come back, and the wind conditions are absolutely atrocious, and he's had to land on the cross strip. Look, that's just one example. We've also potentially, we've got the local fire brigade is going to re-establish a unit there, and that I see as potentially then being able to be used for filling planes for firebombing exercises. So there's some great benefit there. The other benefit that we haven't seen yet, but I think will come back, will be what they call a LAMI, which is a light aircraft maintenance engineers workshop out there. There used to be one, and I think that could come back. So there's the possibility of generating a completely different source of income. And the airport is really essential to that, apart from the fact that there's going to be a lot of business people with the upgrade of the airport who will then fly in because they've got a good airport to land to. So I think the benefits, they're not very easily seen, but I'm sure that they are there. But I do digress a little bit. Really, what we're wanting to do is to ensure that we've covered every avenue to make sure that what we are providing for the future has got safety in mind. And this is what it's all about. At the end of the day, it's safety for our pilots and it's safety for our community. So I highly recommend that you pass this motion.
Thank you, Councillor Hook. In saying that, we've had lots of debate and we're all very much more informed on this particular issue, so it's now appropriate that I put this motion. All in favour? Against? Declare that motion carried. Councillors, we're now moving into a closed meeting, so I must ask this question. Are there any reasons why anyone believes that the agendaed items should not be determined in closed council? No, if that be the case, then I request that a councillor moves the motion that we move into closed meeting of council to consider the closed reports. Thank you, Councillor Moses, and seconded by Councillor Fuller. I'll put that motion. All in favour? Aye. Against? Declare that motion carried. There's maybe no need for me to actually state this now, but for the records, for those who are joining us virtually, I'd like to let you know that everybody has left the gallery within the chambers. We will now be suspending our live stream of our council meeting, as we will be considering and determining items of a confidential nature in closed council. Once they are complete, we will re-establish our live stream on YouTube, and I'll be reading out the determinations of closed meetings. So